When you think of seminal film adaptations of Stephen King's work, you often don't think about Rob Reiner. When you think of Rob Reiner's filmography as a director, you often think of feel-good movies, inspiring stories, comedies. The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men. This is Spinal Tap. Even his first adaptation of a work by Stephen King, 1986's bittersweet coming-of-age drama Stand By Me, adapted from King's novella The Body, wears its heart on its sleeve and is certainly nowhere in the realm of horror. But that all changed with 1990's Misery, widely regarded as one of the all-time best Stephen King adaptations. Hell, it won Kathy Bates an Academy Award for Best Actress, an honor rarely granted to thriller and horror movies. So let's take a look at an iconic sequence from Misery that certainly contributed to Annie Wilkes entering the pantheon as one of the most famous movie villains of all time. It's a sequence that is very similar to the book, except for one notable, gigantic change. This is the Hobbling sequence from Misery. I think anyone who's familiar with Misery, even if they've never read it, they know it's about a rabid fan of an author. The phrase, "I'm your number one fan," is pretty iconic.
I'm your number one fan.
And most people, I'm sure, assume that Stephen King wrote Annie Wilkes with his rabid fans in mind. Here we have a best-selling author who I'm sure has had his fair share of weird and awkward encounters with huge fans. So Misery is about what happens if a fan takes that too far. It makes sense for him to write a book about that, but actually there's a lot going on under the surface. In an interview with Rolling Stone, Stephen King actually said that, quote, "Misery is a book about cocaine. Annie Wilkes is cocaine. She was my number one fan." Stephen King has always been open about his addictions. He's grappling with addictions and recovery. He's a recovering alcoholic. He was addicted to pain pills after he was hit by a van. And during this period when he was writing Misery and the Tommyknockers, he says that basically he was plugging his nose with Kleenex because it was bleeding so much from the cocaine use. So it was very much on his mind. He might have not known it at the time, but in retrospect, he did say that it's a little bit of a deeper meaning than just rabid fandom.
You know something? I sort of enjoyed it.
Let's talk about Kathy Bates as the iconic Annie Wilkes. First off, again, it was very unusual for any actor to be nominated, let alone win an Oscar for their performance in a genre film, especially a thriller or a horror movie. So that was a huge deal when she won the Oscar for Best Actress.
I would like to thank James Caan and apologize publicly for the ankles. And I would like to say that I really am your number one fan.
She was not the first choice for the role. Bette Midler was offered it, turned it down. She regrets that. She turned it down because she thought it was too violent. But Kathy Bates was actually the first choice of William Goldman, the screenwriter. So she eventually got the role, and Stephen King was so impressed with her performance that when he was writing Dolores Claiborne, he actually wrote the role of Dolores Claiborne with Kathy Bates in mind. And sure enough, she played Dolores Claiborne in the 1995 adaptation.
You say you're sorry one more time and I'll kick your butt up so high you'll look like a hunchback.
When Stephen King was adapting his novel The Stand for the TV miniseries, again, he liked Kathy Bates so much that he ended up turning the character of Ray Flowers into a woman and wrote it specifically for Kathy Bates. So Ray Flowers, R-A-Y, becomes Ray Flowers, R-A-E.
That wouldn't be very American now, would it?
James Caan was far from the first choice to play Paul Sheldon. Everybody and their brother was offered the role. Jack Nicholson was, but obviously he had played Jack Torrance in Shining, and for whatever reason, he turned it down. William Hurt was offered it twice, turned it down both times. Robert Redford, Al Pacino, Morgan Freeman, Mel Gibson, Gene Hackman, Dustin Hoffman, Michael Douglas, Harrison Ford, Richard Dreyfuss. Pretty much it's easier to name everybody who wasn't offered the role. Warren Beatty actually was attached for a while, but he had other obligations with Dick Tracy, but his notes actually did contribute to some changes in the screenplay. So James Caan was generally regarded as a firebrand. Anybody who is familiar with his work probably think of him more as a volatile actor. You know, he's Sonny from The Godfather.
God damn it, if I had a wartime consigliere Sicilian, I wouldn't be in a shape.
So the idea of strapping him in a bed and in a wheelchair for the duration of the 15-week shoot was kind of inverting that expectation. You think, God, Annie Wilkes must really be an intimidating force if she can confine Sonny Corleone to a bed. And he actually said that that was a sadistic joke on him because he's known for gesticulating and being big and moving around, and they were just tying him to this bed for weeks on end. So that contributed to a lot of his performance, to his frustration and his exhaustion and anger, especially because his acting style was very different than Kathy Bates's. Kathy Bates liked rehearsing. She really wanted to treat it as a play of sorts, to really go through the scenes together with James Caan, but James Caan is a very impulsive actor and he did not want to over-rehearse. So that clashing of acting styles, I'm sure, contributes to the clashing of the characters. You have this very controlling, very meticulous character in Annie Wilkes wanting to control Paul Sheldon. Paul Sheldon wanting nothing more than to escape, finding himself that he can't. So in some ways, their situation in the movie did mirror real life to a degree, and there's no doubt that that contributed to the authenticity of the performances. Originally, Rob Reiner was not going to direct Misery, but Stephen King had enough of his books adapted to varying degrees of success that he did want to have a little more control over the film adaptations. He especially did not like Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining, which I'm sure led to him being a little more controlling about who adapted his books. But after Rob Reiner directed Stand By Me in 1986, Stephen King really wanted him to be involved in Misery in some way, so he basically said that he only wanted Rob Reiner, whether he direct or produce, which kind of makes sense because after Stand By Me, Rob Reiner was such a Stephen King fan that he actually named his production company Castle Rock, and you might recognize that as the production company of Seinfeld, and that was Rob Reiner.
Jerry, my hairdryer ruined the picture. I know I need another one or I can't get back into the Forbidden City.
Who is this?
Jerry!
Anyways, Stephen King really wanted Rob Reiner to be involved, and Rob Reiner initially was just going to produce and he wasn't going to direct. The original director was George Roy Hill, who had directed Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting, and that was partially why William Goldman, the iconic screenwriter, was involved because he also wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Goldman also adapted Misery later on into a stage play, and Paul Sheldon was played by Bruce Willis, and Annie Wilkes was played by Laurie Metcalf. So before Misery, Rob Reiner had never directed anything remotely like a thriller. So he was definitely stepping out of his comfort zone for handling something like Misery. But he did his homework. He actually watched a lot of Alfred Hitchcock movies very meticulously to see how thrillers were constructed, how scenes of suspense and tension were constructed so that he could essentially use those tactics in Misery. Fans of the novel and the movie know that the major change in the adaptation is that during this hobbling sequence in the book, Annie Wilkes uses an axe and chops off Paul's feet and then cauterizes the wounds. In the movie, she uses a mallet, and this was a point of a lot of contention with the filmmakers because William Goldman was adamant that they keep it like it is in the book. He wanted to keep the axe. George Roy Hill, who was originally going to direct, did not want something that gruesome. He wanted to tone it down. Eventually, he left the project, and Rob Reiner stepped in from producer to director, and he preserved the mallet aspect of it. William Goldman was really not happy about that. He later actually admitted, though, that it was more effective changing it from the axe to the mallet. Otherwise, a lot of the dialogue is very similar to the book, and it plays out pretty similarly. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and read a few passages from the novel to give you an idea of how it compares to the movie. Have you ever read about the early days at the Kimberley Diamond Mines, Paul? I wrote the book on that one, he said for no reason at all, and laughed. Pre-op shot? Sometimes the native workers stole diamonds. They wrapped them in leaves and poked them up their rectums. If they got away from the big hole without being discovered, they would run. And do you know what the British did to them if they got caught before they could get over Orange Riviere and into Boer country? Killed them, I suppose, he said, eyes still closed. Oh no, that would have been like junking an expensive car just because of a broken spring. If they caught them, they made sure that they could go on working, but they also made sure they would never run again. The operation was called Hobbling, Paul, and that is what I'm going to do to you, for my own safety, and yours as well. Believe me, you need to be protected from yourself. Just remember, a little pain and it will be over. Try to hold that thought. Terror, sharp as a gust of wind, filled with razor blades, blew through the dope, and Paul's eyes flew open. She had risen and now drew the bedclothes down, exposing his twisted legs and bare feet. No, he said. No, Annie. Whatever it is you've got on your mind, we can talk about it, can't we? Please. She bent over. When she straightened up, she was holding the axe from the shed in one hand and a propane torch in the other. The blade of the axe gleamed. Written on the side of the propane torch was the word Burns-O-Matic. She bent down again, and this time came up with a dark bottle and the box of matches. There was a label on the dark bottle. Written on the label was the word Betadine. He never forgot these things, these words, these names. Annie, no! He screamed. Annie, I'll stay right here. I won't even get out of bed. Please, oh God, please don't cut me! Her eyes were mild and drifting. Don't worry, she said. I'm a trained nurse. The axe came whistling down and buried itself in Paul Sheldon's left leg just above the ankle. Pain exploded up his body in a gigantic bolt. Dark red blood splattered across her face like Indian war paint. It splattered the wall. He heard the blade squeal against bone as she wrenched it free. He looked unbelievingly down at himself. The sheet was turning red. He saw his toes wriggling. Then he saw her raising the dripping axe again. Her hair had fallen free of its pins and hung around her blank face. He tried to pull back in spite of the pain in his leg and knee and realized that his leg was moving, but his foot wasn't. All he was doing was widening the axe slash, making it open like a mouth. He had time enough to realize his foot was now only held on his leg by the meat of his calf before the blade came down again, directly into the gash, shearing through the rest of his leg and burying itself deep in the mattress. Springs boinked and squoinked. Annie pulled the axe free and tossed it aside. She looked absently at the jetting stump for a moment and then picked up the box of matches. She lit one. Then she picked up the propane torch with the word Burns-O-Matic on the side and twisted the valve on the side. The torch hissed. Blood poured from the place where he no longer was. Annie held the match delicately under the nozzle of the Burns-O-Matic. There was a floof sound. A long yellow flame appeared. Annie adjusted it to be a hard blue line of fire. Can't suture, she said. No time. Tourniquet's no good. No central pressure point. Got to rinse. Cauterize. She bent. Paul screamed as fire splashed over the raw and bleeding stump. Smoke drifted up. It smelled sweet. He and his first wife had honeymooned on Maui. There had been a luau. This smell reminded him of the smell of the pig when they brought it out of the pit where it had cooked all day. The pig had been on a stick, sagging, black, falling apart. The pain was screaming. He was screaming. You'll be all right, Paul, she said, but her voice was suddenly frightened. Her eyes began to dart aimlessly around as they had when it seemed that the fire of his burning book might get out of control. They suddenly fixed on something, almost with relief. I'll just get rid of the trash. She picked up his foot. Its toes were still spasming. She carried it across the room. By the time she got to the door, they had stopped moving. He could see a scar on the instep and remembered how he had gotten that, how he had stepped on a piece of bottle when he was just a kid. Had that been at Revere Beach? Yes, he thought it had been. He remembered he had cried and his father had told him it was just a little cut. His father had told him to stop acting like someone had cut his goddamn foot off. Annie paused at the door and looked back at Paul, who shrieked and writhed in the charred and blood-soaked bed, his face a deathly, fading white. "Now you're hobbled," she said. "And don't you blame me. It's your own fault." She went out. So did Paul. So there you have it, one of the most iconic scenes in any Stephen King film adaptation, the hobbling sequence from Misery. If you'd like to throw in a few bucks to keep the Stephen Kingdom up and running, be sure to support our Patreon, where our patrons get access to all sorts of exclusive content, including deleted scenes, early access to episodes, and your name in the credits. Be sure to subscribe to the Stephen Kingdom channel here and check out our past episodes. Here, long days and pleasant nights, Constant Watchers.